She said if I stayed any longer, she'd make me breakfast tomorrow, and suddenly, I didn't want to leave. It was a quiet evening when I found myself knocking on her door again, almost without thinking. The neighborhood was settling into that soft lull between the bustle of the day and the hush of night. I had no real reason to be there, just a borrowed book I hadn't returned and a vague sense of curiosity that I couldn't quite shake. When she opened the door, I was struck, as always, by her effortless presence. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a way that didn't shout for attention but quietly drew it. Her hair had escaped the casual bun she often wore, a few strands brushing her cheeks, and she gave me that half-smile that always made my chest tighten slightly. "Hey," I said, fumbling for something casual to say. "I thought I'd drop by." Her eyes crinkled at the edges as she tilted her head, a playful warning hiding beneath warmth. "Again?" she teased, though there was no real irritation in her tone. The room behind her glowed softly from the overhead lamp and the flicker of candlelight on the counter, casting her in a golden haze that made the moment feel suspended outside time. I stepped in, trying to act natural, though my senses were immediately captivated. The faint aroma of her perfume mingled with the comforting smell of dinner still lingering in the air. It was ordinary, domestic, yet somehow intimate, like I had stepped into a space that belonged to her entirely, and for a brief, suspended moment, I was part of it. She moved around casually, gesturing toward the sofa with a tilt of her hand. "Sit. Don't make it awkward." Her tone was light, teasing, but her gaze held a quiet steadiness, as if she was quietly measuring how close I was willing to come, emotionally and physically. I sat, careful not to overstep, and she handed me a mug of tea. Her fingers brushed mine for the briefest moment, light, accidental, yet enough to send a subtle warmth through me. I felt my pulse skip, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The warmth of the cup seeped into my hands, but it was nothing compared to the warmth emanating from her presence. We fell into easy conversation, the kind that feels ordinary on the surface but carries the weight of unspoken curiosity. She asked about my day, laughed at my clumsy attempts at humor, and I found myself noticing everything: how her eyes softened when she smiled, how her voice dipped ever so slightly when she leaned closer, how the faint scent of vanilla from a candle curled in the air between us. When I finally stood to leave, she gave me that half-smile again, tilting her head with a playful warning. "If you stay any longer, I might just make you breakfast tomorrow," she said lightly, but I heard something more in her voice, an invitation wrapped in humor. As I walked back to my apartment, the warmth of the evening lingered, a quiet pull in my chest. I didn't want to leave, though I told myself I had to. The thought of returning tomorrow, and perhaps staying longer, was already enough to make my steps hesitant, my mind replaying every glance, every brush of touch, every tiny moment that had made the evening feel impossibly close. The next evening, I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. There was something magnetic about the way she moved through her home, casual and confident, yet undeniably warm. When I knocked again, half apologetic, half anticipatory, her familiar smile greeted me, that same teasing glint in her eyes that made it impossible not to linger. "Back so soon?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, leaning lightly against her doorframe. Her voice was playful, but her posture relaxed, inviting. "Or are you planning to move in permanently?" I laughed nervously, trying to keep my composure, but I couldn't hide the warmth that rose to my cheeks. "Just thought I'd check on my favorite neighbor," I said, letting the words hang between us, slightly daring, slightly embarrassed. She tilted her head, considering me for a moment, and then laughed, a soft, melodic sound that filled the room and made my chest tighten. "Favorite, huh? I should charge for visits like that." She stepped aside, letting me in, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the lingering aroma of dinner. Warmth and comfort enveloped me instantly. We settled on the sofa, a comfortable distance apart, though neither of us made any real effort to maintain it. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and gentle teasing. She made subtle jokes at my expense, and I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn to the quiet charm of her presence. There was a rhythm to her movements, how she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she gestured with her hands while speaking, the brief, almost accidental touch of her fingers against mine as she passed me a cushion. I noticed details I hadn't before, the soft curve of her smile, the way her eyes softened when she laughed, the quiet steadiness in her voice that carried a hidden depth. Each glance lingered just long enough to send a quiet thrill through me, a subtle invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept but couldn't ignore. At one point, she nudged me gently with her elbow, teasing me about something trivial, and I felt a jolt of warmth from the contact. Our laughter faded into a quiet pause, and I realized I was studying her more closely than ever. Every subtle gesture seemed amplified, every glance loaded with meaning I didn't quite understand. "Careful," she said softly, almost under her breath. "You're getting dangerously comfortable here." Her tone was teasing, but the warmth in her eyes betrayed something more. I felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation, aware of the age difference, yet drawn irresistibly closer by the quiet intimacy building between us. The evening stretched on, filled with shared stories, gentle laughter, and lingering touches. Each playful remark, each fleeting contact, heightened the tension without forcing it, creating a slow rhythm of connection that felt natural and unhurried. When I finally stood to leave, she smirked. "You really shouldn't get used to this," she said, though her eyes betrayed a hint of hope, or maybe curiosity. Walking home, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening air. The teasing, the laughter, the subtle touches, they all lingered in my mind, leaving me thinking of her long after I had left, eager for the next encounter, aware that something delicate and meaningful was beginning to take root. A few days later, I found myself back at her door again, though this time it felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a comfort that had begun to settle in, soft but unmistakable. When she opened the door, her familiar smile greeted me, but her eyes carried a trace of something new, something quieter, more reflective. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice light, though I sensed a weight in the air that wasn't there before. She stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Come in," she said softly. "I wasn't expecting anyone tonight, but I'm glad you're here." Her words were casual, yet there was an edge of vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. We sat together in the living room, the glow of the lamplight casting soft shadows across her face. The quiet hum of the city outside and the faint aroma of her evening tea created a cocoon of calm, intimate space. I watched her as she spoke, noticing the small gestures that made her so human, the way she twirled a strand of hair around her finger, the subtle shift of her shoulders when she relaxed, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of something personal. Eventually, the conversation turned to more personal topics. She shared something delicate, a recent disappointment at work, a moment of loneliness, a fleeting memory that still stung. Her voice trembled slightly, and I felt a pang of protectiveness stir within me. I listened closely, careful not to interrupt, letting her words wash over me. At one point, her hand brushed against mine, almost accidental, almost shy. The touch was brief, but it sent a quiet warmth through me, grounding me in the moment. I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she spoke, the way her fingers lingered near mine as if seeking some quiet reassurance. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would make her feel less alone, but words felt inadequate. Instead, I let her feel my attention, my presence, my willingness to simply be there. When she finally looked up, our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. There was a quiet understanding between us, an acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, of emotions too delicate to voice outright. "Thank you," she said softly, almost as if to herself, but I felt the words directed at me. The faint warmth of her hand lingered against mine, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a closeness that words could never capture. We stayed in that quiet space for a while, talking in low tones, our movements slow and unhurried. Each laugh was softer, each glance lingered longer, and each brush of touch carried meaning. There was no rush, no pressure, just the steady rhythm of two people slowly bridging the gap between friendship and something more. When I left that night, the lingering warmth of her presence followed me down the hallway, the memory of her voice, her smile, and that fleeting touch settling into my chest. I walked home aware that our connection was deepening, that the playful teasing and casual visits were giving way to something more profound. And for the first time, I realized that the pull I felt toward her wasn't just curiosity. It was the quiet beginning of something I didn't want to resist. That evening, I wasn't sure why I found myself standing outside her door again, but something inside me refused to stay away. Maybe it was the quiet warmth she radiated, or the way our interactions had begun to feel like an unspoken ritual, each visit leaving a mark I couldn't ignore. When she opened the door, the familiar spark of amusement in her eyes greeted me, and I felt my chest tighten, as if my heartbeat had been waiting for this very sight. "You again?" she asked, though her tone was playful, not scolding. "Do you ever knock on anyone else's door this often?" "Only the neighbors who make it worth knocking," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my smile betrayed me. She laughed, that soft, melodic laugh that always seemed to echo in my chest long after it left the room. We moved into the living room, a comfortable distance apart at first, though it didn't stay that way. She was fiddling with a small stack of books, and I reached for one at the same time. Our fingers brushed briefly, sending a subtle warmth up my arm. We both laughed at the awkward timing, and in that moment, the distance between us seemed to shrink without either of us consciously moving closer. Her eyes twinkled as she teased me, pointing out my clumsy attempt to reach over her. "You're too eager," she said lightly, shaking her head with a grin. "I might have to start charging for these visits." I laughed, but my gaze lingered on her face, noticing the way the lamplight softened her features, the gentle curve of her smile, the subtle tilt of her head that made her look effortlessly inviting. Each gesture she made felt like it carried intention, even in its casualness. We settled on the sofa, side by side, though I wasn't quite aware of how close we had actually become until I felt the soft brush of her shoulder against mine. Neither of us moved away. Instead, we adjusted slightly, both careful yet unconsciously leaning in. The proximity was comforting, yet it carried an unspoken thrill. A small mishap with a cushion sent us both laughing. She toppled slightly toward me, and I caught her instinctively. Her hand lingered on my arm longer than necessary, and I could feel the subtle warmth of her skin. We froze for a heartbeat, eyes meeting, and the room seemed to contract around us. The teasing and laughter faded into a quiet, intimate pause, filled with tension neither of us rushed to break. I realized then how much I was noticing, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the gentle scent of her perfume mingling with the faint aroma of her evening tea, the way her hair fell just so across her cheek. It was effortless, natural, yet it made my awareness of her impossible to ignore. When the moment passed, we laughed again, easing the tension, but the closeness lingered, unspoken and comforting. By the time I left that night, I was aware of a new rhythm between us, a slow, playful intimacy built on shared laughter, accidental touches, and the quiet thrill of proximity. Walking home, I could still feel her presence beside me, the accidental brush of her hand, the warmth of her shoulder, the sound of her laughter. It stayed with me, a soft echo that made me eager for the next visit, the next accidental closeness that would bring us just a little nearer. That night, I found myself outside her door once again, unsure whether I had a reason to be there or if I was simply drawn by the quiet pull she seemed to exert on me. When she opened the door, her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, everything else, the city lights, the hum of distant traffic, even the very air, faded away. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice light but carrying that familiar warmth. She leaned slightly against the doorframe, one hand tucked casually in her pocket, the other loosely holding the door. Or are you just here for me now? I laughed nervously, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. Maybe a little of both, I admitted, unable to hide the truth. Her smile deepened, soft and knowing, and I realized she could see right through me. Inside, the apartment was bathed in soft light, the familiar aroma of her evening tea lingering in the air. We settled on the sofa as usual, though tonight, the distance between us seemed smaller somehow, almost imperceptibly. My fingers brushed against hers as I reached for the remote, and the brief contact sent an unexpected warmth coursing through me. She didn't pull away, she simply adjusted slightly, maintaining the subtle closeness. For a while, we spoke lightly, teasing each other, sharing small stories of the day. But then a quiet pause fell over us, a moment where neither words nor laughter seemed necessary. I felt the weight of her gaze, soft but unwavering, and my heart thumped in a way I couldn't quite control. I wanted to lean closer, maybe rest my hand near hers or brush a strand of hair from her face, but hesitation held me back. She noticed it too, of course. A faint smirk touched her lips, playful yet loaded with meaning. You know, she said softly, if you stay any longer, I might just make you breakfast tomorrow. Her voice was teasing, but the glimmer in her eyes betrayed something more, an invitation, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension simmering between us. I swallowed, aware of my racing heartbeat. The words lingered in the air, playful but charged, and I realized how much I wanted to stay, wanted to close the small distance between us but afraid to cross the line. The air between us seemed to hum with anticipation, each glance, each small movement, magnified. The warmth of her presence was intoxicating. I noticed how the soft lamplight highlighted the curve of her cheek, the subtle arch of her brow, the gentle way her fingers rested near mine. Every detail drew me closer, yet I held back, savoring the moment without rushing it. Finally, she leaned slightly closer, brushing a hand against mine in a casual gesture that felt anything but casual. My chest tightened, a quiet thrill running through me. There was no need for words. The glance we shared said everything. Desire tempered by hesitation, affection wrapped in playful restraint, connection deepening in the quiet intimacy of shared space. When I left that night, my steps were slow, reluctant. The teasing promise of breakfast lingered, the warmth of her hand lingered, the subtle pull of her presence lingered. And I knew, without doubt, that every moment we shared was leading us somewhere I didn't want to resist, somewhere neither of us needed to rush, but both of us were quietly, irresistibly drawn. The following evening, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The teasing, the laughter, the warmth of her presence, all of it lingered in my mind, pulling me back to her doorstep almost instinctively. When I arrived, she opened the door, wearing that same quiet smile that always made my chest tighten. "Here you are again," she said softly, though there was no reproach, only curiosity and warmth. Her eyes flicked toward mine, holding a subtle depth, a question unspoken. "I was wondering when you'd show up next." Inside, the apartment felt especially intimate that night. The glow of the lamps cast soft shadows on her walls, and the faint scent of vanilla from a candle mixed with the lingering aroma of her tea, creating a cocoon of calm. We sat together, side by side on the sofa, the casual proximity from our previous evenings now familiar and comforting. We spoke quietly, sharing small thoughts about the day, the city, and fleeting moments of life that often go unnoticed. But eventually, the conversation slowed, and a comfortable silence settled between us. I noticed her gaze on me, gentle and unwavering, and it compelled me to speak, though not casually, not lightly. I really enjoyed being here," I admitted, my voice soft, almost hesitant. "With you. It's different from anywhere else." My words hung in the air, vulnerable yet honest. She didn't respond immediately, only watched me with that familiar warmth, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. For a moment, the room felt smaller, more intimate. She shifted slightly, letting her arm brush against mine, a subtle, accidental touch that sent a quiet warmth through me. "I enjoy your visits," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity that made my chest tighten. "More than you probably realize." I swallowed, aware of how close we had become, not just physically, but emotionally. There was something fragile yet thrilling in the way our hands nearly touched, in the way our shoulders leaned ever so slightly toward each other, in the way her gaze held mine for just a heartbeat too long. Every small gesture carried meaning, every glance hinted at emotions unspoken. We stayed like that for a while, simply existing in the same space, letting the quiet intimacy build. She leaned slightly closer, her head tilting just enough that the soft scent of her perfume reached me fully. My fingers brushed hers in what felt like an innocent, casual movement, yet neither of us pulled away. Instead, the contact lingered, warm and grounding. "I don't think I've ever felt this comfortable with anyone," I admitted quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled softly, a hint of vulnerability beneath the confidence she always carried. "Neither have I," she replied, and in that moment, words weren't necessary. The unspoken understanding between us, desire tempered by respect, closeness softened by patience, was enough. By the time I left that night, the memory of her warmth, her voice, and the subtle, lingering touches followed me. There was no rush, no pressure, only a quiet, profound connection that neither of us needed to name yet. I knew, as I walked away, that this slow, gentle intimacy was becoming something I wanted to nurture, something worth waiting for, something that might just turn into the heart of a lasting romance. Morning light filtered gently through her curtains, painting the apartment in soft gold. I woke to the quiet hum of the city outside and a warmth beside me that wasn't just from the sunlight. I had stayed the night, something I hadn't planned yet couldn't resist. The teasing promise she had made a few nights ago, about breakfast, now hung in the air like a gentle, playful invitation. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair slightly tousled, an oversized sweater slipping comfortably over her shoulders. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice carrying that familiar warmth and a hint of amusement. "I hope you're ready for breakfast, if you can call it that." I smiled, feeling a flutter in my chest. "I think anything you make is worth waking up for," I replied, and she laughed, the sound melodic and light, filling the room with an ease I had come to crave. The kitchen smelled of fresh toast, brewed coffee, and something sweet, maybe a hint of cinnamon or vanilla. She moved around with casual grace, flipping pancakes and stirring a pot of something that smelled delicious. Occasionally, her fingers brushed mine as she passed me utensils or handed over a plate, each touch fleeting yet electric, grounding and thrilling all at once. We sat together at her small kitchen table, shoulders occasionally brushing, laughter spilling freely between us. She teased me about my insistence on pouring the syrup over my pancakes just so, and I watched her smile, the warmth in her eyes making my chest tighten. Every glance, every small movement carried unspoken affection, a quiet intimacy that words could barely capture. At one point I reached for my cup of coffee and found her hand brushing against mine. Neither of us pulled away. Instead, we lingered in that touch, a simple gesture loaded with meaning, acknowledgement of the feelings that had grown quietly between us over the past few evenings. "I'm glad you stayed," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine across the table. I like having you here." The words were simple, yet the sincerity behind them struck me more than any grand declaration ever could. I smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the morning sun. "Me too," I admitted, my voice low. "More than I expected." We ate in a comfortable silence, punctuated by shared laughter and the occasional glance that spoke volumes. The age difference, which had seemed like an invisible barrier, now felt irrelevant, overshadowed by the connection we had built, the trust, the quiet understanding, and the playful intimacy that had grown between us. When the breakfast plates were cleared, she leaned back in her chair, stretching slightly, and I noticed the subtle curve of her smile, the gentle light in her eyes. "You know," she said teasingly, "I might just get used to you staying over, if you behave." "I'll try my best," I replied, and we both laughed, the sound mingling warmly in the sunlit kitchen. That morning, as I finally left her apartment, I carried with me more than just the memory of breakfast. I carried the quiet knowledge that something meaningful had begun, a connection built slowly, gently, with laughter, teasing, shared moments, and subtle touches. It wasn't rushed or forced, it was real, heartfelt, and ours. And I knew that this was only the beginning of a slow-burning romance I didn't want to end.